Today's speaker is Peter Leeson. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University, and he's going to talk today about trial by battle. There's swords available after today's talk. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, that's all legible, right? Yes. All right. The paper I'm going to talk to you about today, as Dan mentioned, is Medieval Trial by Battle. My argument is that medieval trial by battle worked. And what I mean by worked is that it allocated disputed property rights to their higher valuing users. When all of the drama is stripped away from them, the fundamental elements of trial by battle procedures are sensible, as hard as that may seem be to believe. Those procedures closely resemble ones we would expect a reasonable legal system to employ, to help it to discover the efficient owners of disputed property rights when that system is uncertain about those property rights' true owners. All legal systems, modern and historical, would ideally like to assign disputed property rights to their true owners, to the people who actually are their owners. Sometimes, however, despite their best attempts, judges are unable to discover who the true owner of a disputed property right is. When this is the case, the next best thing that judges can do is to assign the disputed property right to the disputant who values it more. Although judges may not be able to discover which disputant is the true owner of the disputed property right, judges can discover which disputant values the disputed property right more. An economically sensible approach to attempting to discover a disputed property right's higher valuing user involves asking the disputants to bid on the disputed property right in an auction. The higher valuing user is likely to bid more for the disputed right in such an auction than the lower valuing user. Thus, the auction tends to reveal the higher valuing disputant's identity and allocates the disputed property right to him. The result is an efficient allocation of disputed property rights. Modern legal systems may attempt to leverage this logic, at least in part. Take, for example, adversarial procedure used in the common law system. Under that procedure, the disputant who values a disputed property right more is willing to spend more money in the adversarial process in order to win that right. He's willing to hire a better lawyer, to pay his lawyer to spend more hours building his case, and so on. If legal expenditures are positively correlated with legal victory, the higher valuing disputant is more likely to win the disputed right. There's an auction-like element to the legal process here, and a tendency to allocate the disputed right to the higher bidder. Such legal auctions, as we might call them, differ in some important respects from regular auctions. That is, the single price ascending bid variety, the type of auction that you normally think of when you think of an auction. Those peculiar features of legal auctions, however, may permit legal auctions to efficiently allocate disputed property rights at a lower social cost than regular auctions could achieve. For example, unlike in regular auctions, in legal auctions, both the higher bidder and the lower bidder must pay their bid. This encourages lower valuing users to make lower bids in legal auctions than they would in regular auctions. That, in turn, allows higher valuing users to make lower bids in legal auctions than they would in regular auctions as well. As a result, disputants may spend fewer resources attempting to affect the allocation of disputed property rights in legal auctions compared to what they would do in regular ones. Further, unlike in regular auctions, in legal auctions, the higher bidder only wins the auction probabilistically. It's possible for the lower bidder to upset him. This randomness, if you want to think about it that way, in legal auctions, decreases the value of higher bids and encourages the disputants to make lower bids than they would in regular auctions. The result, again, is that disputants may spend fewer resources attempting to affect the allocation of disputed property rights in legal auctions compared to regular ones. My argument about medieval trial by battle is that it may have functioned as something like such a legal auction in the way in which it discovered disputed property rights efficient owners and the way in which it allocated disputed property rights to those owners in the Middle Ages. The unique aspect of trial by battle is the way in which it used literal battles to conduct such legal auctions. The heyday of trial by battle was 11th through 12th century England. During that era, a person contested another person's property right in land by initiating an action that was called a writ of right. Under that action, the plaintiff, who was called a demandant, requested a royal official to draw up a document which would compel the defendant, who was called a tenant, to appear before a court to defend his property claim. Once the disputants were in front of the judge, the demandant would offer the court a lengthy statement in which he would attempt to connect himself to the contested parcel of property through his lineage. In addition to that, he would supply a witness who would testify to the validity of his story. A tenant rebuffed a demandant's challenge by offering his own lengthy statement to the court, in which he attempted to connect himself to the contested parcel of property through his ancestors. The tenant also produced a witness who would testify to the legitimacy of his story. Now, the problem, of course, from judges' perspective, is that the kind of evidence that this process generated was typically useless in allowing them to discover which disputant was in fact the true owner of the disputed property right in question. There was no reliable method judges could use to weigh what amounted to conflicting claims of property ownership from disputants and witnesses on either side of the issue. In the face of this problem, judges attempted to do the next best thing they could do, which was to assign the disputed property right to the disputant who valued it more. Now, in order to do that, what judges needed to do was to discover which disputant was the higher valuing user of the contested property right in question. Judges' means of doing this was a legal battle with a kind of violent flair to it. A legal auction with a violent flair to it. That legal auction was trial by battle. Under trial by battle, judges ordered each of the disputants to procure a legal representative who was called a champion. The judges would then order both of the disputants and their champions to appear before them and before an arena of spectating citizens on a specified date. In the arena, on that date, the judges would order the champions to pummel one another. A champion could win this physical fight by either killing his legal adversary or by forcing his adversary to submit to him. The victorious champion's employer won the case at hand and thus received the contested property right. The losing champion's employer lost the case and thus did not receive the contested property right. Now, in order to see how trial by battle may have functioned like a legal auction along the lines I described before, consider the following. In the Middle Ages, there was a market for legal representatives in much the same way that there's a market for legal representatives today. Also, like today, in the Middle Ages, higher quality legal representatives commanded higher prices in that market than lower quality legal representatives. In the medieval context, higher quality referred to a legal representative's physical superiority, his greater size, his greater strength, his greater speed, or some other attribute that made him more likely to defeat his opponent in a physical fight. Lower quality referred to a legal representative's physical inferiority, his smallness, his wimpiness, his timidity, his slowness, or some other attribute that made him more likely to be defeated by his opponent in a physical fight. Through this market for legal representatives, medieval disputants were able to indirectly bid, so to speak, on the contested property right in question. The higher valuing disputant was willing to spend more money to procure his legal representative. Thus, he was able to purchase a higher quality champion who was more likely to defeat his adversary in the arena. The lower valuing disputant was only willing to spend fewer resources to procure his legal champion. Thus, he was only able to purchase a lower quality champion who was more likely to be defeated by his adversary in the arena. In this way, trial by battle tended to reveal the higher valuing disputant's identity and to allocate the contested property right in question to him. It's that simple. Trial by battle functioned as a legal auction. Now, there's an obvious question here. There are actually several obvious questions. I'll go through two of them. There's an obvious question here, which is one that's probably occurred to you. And that question is the one that you've probably already read as I was drinking, which is, why would any reasonable legal system rely on an auction in order to efficiently allocate disputed property rights, when it could rely on the market for that purpose instead and save the cost of performing the auction? There's this thing called the Coase theorem. And what the Coase theorem tells us is that when transaction costs are low, judges' initial assignment of disputed property rights doesn't matter. Whoever judges assign those disputed property rights to, the market will tend to reshuffle them into the hands of the higher valuing user. We don't need an auction to allocate disputed property rights efficiently. We can simply use the market. Why then use an auction? There's an obvious answer to this obvious question, which is that when transaction costs of trade are high, the Coase theorem logic I pointed to a moment ago, of course, breaks down. In this case, judges' initial assignment of disputed property rights matters greatly. When transaction costs are high, we can't rely on the market to reshuffle disputed property rights into the hands of higher valuing users. High transaction costs preclude such reshuffling. In this case, property rights tend to stick. They tend to permanently remain in the hands of those individuals to whom judges initially allocate them. Thus, getting an efficient allocation, getting the first allocation correct, is very, very important. In this case, we can't rely on the market to allocate disputed property rights efficiently, so we rely on an auction to do so instead. In the Middle Ages, there were extremely high transaction costs of trading land, and consequently very sticky property rights in the sense that I mentioned a moment ago for that land. The reason that transaction costs of trading land were so high in the Middle Ages, as any student of history will know, is because of feudalism. What feudalism did was created an elaborate web of lord-tenant relationships connected by parcels of property. A tenant would offer his military services and his labor services to some lord in return for the lord's protection. Almost everyone in this system was a lord and a tenant of multiple other individuals. There were lots of problems with feudalism. One of the most important problems that feudalism presented, however, was that it created lots and lots of potential for negative externalities. Because of that large interconnected web that the feudal chain created, the property-related decisions that any one individual on that web made were likely to generate, or at least in principle could generate, negative spillovers for lots of other people connected through that web. For example, if a tenant wanted to sell his tenancy, his property, he could directly harm his lord by doing so. What he could do, for example, would be to sell his property to a tenant who, let's say, was an inferior worker. He could just be a weaker guy than the original tenant was. That would inhibit that new tenant's ability to perform the services that the old tenant owed his lord, directly harming the lord's interest. However, the problem didn't stop there. In inhibiting that lord's ability to receive his services, that new tenant hampered that lord's ability to perform the services that he owed his lord in his capacity as that lord's tenant, which in turn could harm that lord's ability to perform services for his lord, and so on, throughout the feudal chain. Large negative externalities. There's a simple solution to this problem, which is the one that medieval law developed, and that is to have something like a consent requirement. What medieval law said was, because of these kinds of externality problems, if you want to alienate property, and you're on this feudal chain, you need to get the consent of a whole bunch of other individuals who are connected, somewhat remotely in many cases, to the individual who was considering alienating his property.
Sorry, alienate means?
Alienate means to sell.
To sell.
Yes. Technically, it could also mean to rent it out in some capacity, though it's slightly broader than selling. But yes, to sell. You can think about it as selling in this case. So this was a reasonable solution to the externality problem. The difficulty it created was that it dramatically increased the transaction costs of trading land. You now had to get the consent of a very large number of individuals in order to sell your property. Because of this, the land market in the Middle Ages was entirely stifled. In the period that we're considering here, the 11th and 12th century, the medieval land market more or less didn't exist. It's a kind of remarkable thing to think about today, but it essentially didn't exist because of this. As a consequence, property rights in land were extraordinarily sticky. Thus, when judges had a disputed property right case come before them, if efficiency was a consideration, it was crucially important that they get that initial allocation right, that they discover the higher valuing user and allocate the property to him. If they didn't, the resulting inefficiency would remain in perpetuity. Because of the absence of a land market in light of the consent requirements, judges couldn't rely on a market for that purpose. Coase theorem was inoperable. They used an auction instead. That auction was trial by battle, as I described before. There's another obvious question, which I hope and presume has occurred to you, and that is the following one. Even if, for example, high transaction costs prohibit the market from allocating disputed property rights efficiently, such that the system needs to rely on an auction in order to achieve this function, why would a reasonable legal system ever resort to a legal auction? Why not just use a regular auction for that purpose? It's much more simple and straightforward. In the regular auction format, for example, you would have the disputants come before a judge. The judge would announce the contested parcel of property, which the disputants would be aware of. He'd say, let's start the bidding. The disputants would shout out prices. Eventually, one of them would stop. The judge would assign the disputed property right to the person who shouted out the highest price, and the auction proceeds, the bids, would accrue to the judge. Seems much more straightforward than the trial by battle legal auction that I've been describing for you so far. There is an obvious answer to this obvious question as well, although this answer might be slightly less obvious. Regular auctions of that form, by the way, for those of you who care about or are familiar with auction theory, right? By regular auction, as I mentioned before, I mean a single price ascending bid auction. What I keep calling a legal auction for brevity and for simplicity is in fact what's called an imperfectly discriminating all-pay auction. You may not care, but I just thought I would point that out in case it's useful to you. It turns out that these regular auctions are more costly than legal auctions for performing this function. Wherever there are auctions of any kind, there are bids. That's what an auction means. And wherever there are bids, there are bid recipients. When bid levels, when the levels that disputants, that the auction contestants are bidding, when those levels are higher, when their bids are higher, disputants have a perverse incentive to hope that there are more property disputes. The reason, of course, is that when there are more property disputes, there are more auctions. And when there are more auctions, there are more bid receipts. And when there are more bid receipts, bid recipients make more money. There's a second reason that higher bid levels can result in a greater social cost for a legal auction. And that reason is that when bid recipients' incomes are higher because bid levels are higher, that attracts resources from productive areas of the economy into the unproductive bid recipient sector, so to speak. For those, and I know we have differing levels of background here, but for those who are familiar, that's what's called rent seeking. Those are rent seeking costs. So in order to keep the social cost of any form of auction for allocating disputed property rights down, for those two reasons, it's critically important to keep bid levels down. It turns out that legal auctions tend to produce lower bid levels than regular auctions, which is why they are more efficient. There are two reasons for this. Again, this will be old hat for those who are familiar with auction theory. Both of these reasons I mentioned in the very introduction of my presentation. The first reason is that in a legal auction, remember, the lower valuing disputant has to pay his bid. In a regular auction, this isn't true. It's free for him to make his bid up to the valuation of what he places on the contested property right. In a legal auction, the lower valuing disputant expects to be outbid by the higher valuing disputant. He wants to throw some money into the arena, so to speak, for reasons that I'll talk about in a minute. But he expects to be beat, and since he's going to have to pay whatever he bids, this encourages him to make a lower bid. The fact that he's making a lower bid allows the higher valuing disputant to make a lower bid too. That's reason one why bid levels tend to, intuitively, why bid levels tend to be lower in legal auctions. Reason two is something that I pointed to also in the introduction, and that is that in legal auctions there is some degree of randomness. The higher bidder doesn't win the auction with certainty. Think about this in the context of trial by battle. This is also, by the way, why the lower valuing disputant always wants to bid something in the auction, even though he expects to be beat. Think about it in the trial by battle context. It's possible that the lower valuing disputant's inferior champion will upset the higher valuing disputant's better champion. It's just like when a crappy sports team defeats a superior sports team. It's not impossible for this to happen, it's just unlikely. That fact is not so in a regular auction. What characterizes a regular auction is the fact that the higher bidder wins the auction with certainty. That difference between legal auctions and regular auctions is what I called randomness before. And what that randomness does is decreases the value of higher bids in the auction. And in doing so, gives the disputants an incentive to make lower bids than they would in a regular auction. Okay. Let's call those higher bid levels that occur in regular auctions compared to legal auctions a regular auction's rent-seeking cost. We're going to come back to that terminology in a moment. Quite apart from that rent-seeking inferiority of regular auctions have a clear superiority compared to legal auctions. And that superiority stems from what I was just talking about a moment ago. In a regular auction, there is always allocative efficiency. The higher valuing disputant gets the contested right in this case with certainty. The fact that that doesn't always happen in a legal auction results in an allocative inefficiency in that case. Sometimes the guy who wants it more doesn't get it. That's costly. So what we need to do in order to determine which of these auctions is going to be superior overall, a regular or a legal one, which one has a lower total social cost, what we need to do is to consider regular auctions' rent-seeking costs, those higher bid levels, plus, which isn't up here because it's zero, its allocative cost. It's allocatively efficient, so it has no allocative cost. We need to compare then regular auctions' rent-seeking cost to a legal auction's lower rent-seeking cost. It produces lower bid levels, but its positive level of allocative inefficiency. Those are the two things that need to be weighed. Solving for this, it turns out that if the lower valuing user's valuation of the contested property right is at least half as high as the higher valuing user's valuation of the contested property right, When that is satisfied, legal auction is superior overall. It allocates disputed property rights at a lower total social cost than regular auctions do. When that's not satisfied, regular auctions are more efficient. I didn't know where to put this point, so I put it on this slide, and I'm going to bring it up now. It's related, but slightly arbitrary. One of the things that you might think, that you might worry about with a system of trial by battle, goes back to what I was talking about a moment ago in terms of rent-seeking costs. You might worry that some rich, clever bully would go around and say, I'm going to hire, a really high-quality champion and basically extort weaker guys, people who have less money than me, for example. It doesn't always have to even be people who have less money than me. I'm going to run around and I'm going to basically extort the nuisance value of lawsuits. To be sure, there was absolutely scope for such behavior under trial by battle. And in no way do I wish to argue that that didn't happen. Incidentally, every single legal system has that problem. There is no legal system that eliminates the nuisance value of lawsuits. There were certain things that the trial by battle system did, not unlike the kinds of things that our current legal system does, to try and minimize that type of behavior. But you can't eliminate it. What you can do to try and minimize it is to basically have some screen for what kinds of cases come before you. So if I randomly sue somebody in this room for selling me a broken cell phone, when in fact you've never sold me a cell phone before, and I try and bring that before a court, a judge or somebody prior to the judge will screen it and say, that's not a colorable claim. We're throwing it out. You have no evidence whatsoever. That's just you're just trying to basically extort this individual for the nuisance value of the suit. They did the same thing under trial by battle. There were two sorts of screens, which I only briefly passed over, but maybe you thought about a little bit when I was mentioning them. There are two kinds of screens that are used here. The first screen, remember, is that the demandant initiates his action under a writ of right. He starts the proceedings for a trial by battle by asking a royal official to write up some kind of a note that will compel the defendant, the tenant, to appear before the court. In exactly the same way that the judge will throw out my phony cell phone suit against you, medieval judges could throw out suits that appeared to be totally implausible to them. Now, again, just as a function of technology, they were very bad at screening. It was often unclear. Remember that part of the whole reason that this system is being used, going back to my earlier comments, was that judges couldn't figure out who the true property owner was. That's what they wanted to do. Every system does best when property rights are protected. No doubt about that. The question is, what do you do when property rights aren't protected? I really have no idea. It's 50-50. Are you the owner, or is this other guy the owner? That's when we resort to this system. That very feature, the difficulty of those cases for trial by battle, made screening hard for judges. But they still had an attempted screen in place, and that was the first one. The second screen was that, remember that when you go to trial, both disputants need to produce a witness. Now, as you might imagine, you could pretty easily procure a witness for some pocket change probably, but the legal system tried to cope with this. At a minimum, they said, well, let's restrict people who can be witnesses to people who are less likely to accept pocket change in order to lie. Who are those kinds of people? Those kinds of people are people who haven't been committed of a crime in the past, people whose repute is beyond question. Those are the kinds of people who are allowed to act as witnesses. Other people couldn't act as a witness. If you had been found lying, if you had perjured yourself to the court before, or they believed that you were shady because you'd been convicted of a crime, you couldn't act as a witness. So those are the types of screens that they had. Okay, back to this bullet point. That was all by way of hoping to illuminate a little bit about this. What you might be worried about in this system, remember, was the guy running around and extorting people, rent-seeking activity. If in fact rent-seeking were rampant, one thing that you might expect, and I'm not trying to put a lot of weight on this, which is why I call it circumstantial evidentiary support. And in the paper, I try to go to great lengths to point out that there are other things that could explain the stylized fact I'm going to point to you. This is just helpful. To me, it was surprising. If you imagine you're in a system in which you expect that your property rights are constantly under threat by somebody fraudulently initiating a dispute against you by hiring a better champion, or in such a system where you have plenty of opportunities to extort others. In that system, what you would expect is that people would have lawyers, which were of course just champions in this case. You may have noticed the similarity to our current system, on retainer. It would have made sense to have your favorite champion in the stable ready to go. In fact, what we find during this era is that retainers for champions were extraordinarily rare, for what that's worth. Okay.
So,
Please, don't
speak to this last point. 2 points. You said that the system ended in 1179. Was that?
It didn't end in 1179. What happened in 1179 was that another option was introduced alongside trial by battle.
So I'm curious, more efficient option, or if this is so efficient, if this really has all the virtues that you've been describing.
Yes.
Why don't we get phased out?
That's an excellent question. Well, what would the theory predict would cause it to be phased out? What the theory tells us, right, is that the reason that we're using this is because the transaction costs of trade are really, really high. Right? So when the transaction costs of trade become low, when now a market in land is possible, the efficient thing to do is to let the market allocate disputed property rights instead of using legal auctions for that purpose. So, if you'll allow me to shoot ahead. There's our prediction. Here's our evidence. What you have happening exactly around 1179 is precisely a dramatic decline in the transaction costs of trading land. Why did those transaction costs of trading land decline so precipitously? History buffs will know about the Angevin reforms, which occurred between 1175 and 1200. What happened during the Angevin reforms is that the consent requirements for alienating land, for selling it, were abolished. They were abolished for several reasons that historians kind of assign various weights to. Within the historical literature, there's lots of debates about that. These are the examples that are given here. But what you have happen in 1179 at the Council of Windsor is precisely after the alienation consent requirement is abolished, is that we have trial by battle being phased out. Now what happens is that the tenant has the option when a demandant initiates a writ of right. The tenant can say, I'd like to go to trial by battle, which almost nobody does, or I'd like to be heard by a jury of my peers. Now there's an interesting, we move to trial by jury. This, by the way, is the birth of trial by jury in civil actions. For those of you who are interested. We got it in criminal actions when ordeals went away, something I've written about elsewhere. An interesting institution. So let's think about juries for a moment, right? This is one interesting thing to think about here. Juries, modern juries, I don't want to say modern legal systems. The battle process that we see there between champions, between lawyers, as I tried to sort of draw the parallel to in my earlier remarks, looks very, very similar to this process. Only instead of clubbing each other with actual sticks, they club each other with legal arguments. It's essentially the same system, which is no surprise that we inherited from the English. What we've done over time, however, is had technological advance that makes us much, much better at fact-finding. Today, we are much better able to determine when a disputed parcel of property comes before a judge who the true owner is. We can achieve the first best. Why can we achieve the first best? Because we have this remarkably simple and yet incredibly important development, which is that we have deeds for land, and we record them in a centralized place. That's why we know. We still don't have certainty, but in many cases we have certainty. So, when that's the case, right? And by the way, I should point out that even when those deeds aren't available, our modern adversarial process is actually useful in terms of generating information about who the true owner likely is. We've gotten much better over time at being able to use the process to generate that information. Trial by battle was the most primitive version of that. The battle process itself generated exactly zero evidence about who was the true owner of the property right. Hopefully, you believe that our adversarial system, and actually, as also I've written about elsewhere, it's important that you believe this. Hopefully you believe that our adversarial system sheds light on evidence related to who the true owner might be. If it does, then the system works better. Now, imagine in the modern context that we don't know who the true owner is. Imagine that it's a special case where we're back in basically the medieval equivalent. The judge doesn't know what to do. The efficient thing for a judge to do is to do what? Coase theorem? Whatever the hell he wants. Flip a coin. Exactly. What's as good as flipping a coin, but has a nice little benefit, is a jury. Do you really think that those people sitting in that box have some magical power? Access to special information? Juries are kind of like coin flips if you take away the other elements that I was just talking about, that discovery process that happens in most trials. But there's a benefit of using a jury over flipping a coin, and that is that when we use a jury, we preserve the idea, which is important for the functionality of any legal system. We preserve the idea that we're not just flipping a coin. How would you feel if the judge literally whipped a $50 out of his pocket? Yours. You wouldn't have much faith in the system. Faith in the system actually is really, really important. There's a thing that I've written about called an institutional placebo effect, according to which institutions work largely because people think that they work, quite independent of their objective ability to function. I think that that's in part what's happening when we get the emergence of trial by battle in the Middle Ages. One of the reasons that I'm confident in this is that what the trial by battle process does is attempts to hide the fact that what it's doing is similar to the coin flip. It's not doing the coin flip in that it's picking randomly. It's using an auction to allocate disputed property rights efficiently. But judges don't stand before the disputants and say, well, let's figure out who the higher valuing user is. This is an important reason why you don't want to actually have a regular auction. The reason that you don't want to do that is that it's incredibly destructive to property rights. Much better for people to believe that the process you're using is actually discovering who the true owner of the disputed property right is. Much less injurious to property rights. So a question is, how did the trial by battle system do that? The way that the trial by battle system did that was by telling you that hitting of one another with sticks in the arena was an act of God. God would only favor the rightful disputant in a physical match. So, when William of Copeland, who I talk about a bit in the paper, a strong, sturdy champion who commanded a very high price in the market, when he enters the arena and clobbers his adversary, we say that, this is God showing favor to the rightful disputant. That's the medieval equivalent of us pretending that juries do something in many cases. Do something other than approximate a coin flip. That's why they shroud it in this idea about God's behavior behind it. Now, incidentally, and I think this is part of the reason why probably trial by battle didn't last longer than it did, although it lasted for quite a while, is that it's quite easy to figure out, if you're a participant in the system, that God is not, in fact, behind William of Copeland winning. The whole reason you start to think to yourself that you hired William of Copeland was that he had a reputation for winning. He was a strapping young fellow who was likely to defeat all of his opponents. It didn't have much to do with God. It had to do with the fact that he was really strong. In the face of such obvious evidence, it seems to me anyway, and I'm of course speculating now, it seems to me that most disputants would have realized God had nothing to do with this system. In that sense, trial by battle wasn't as good at protecting property rights as we would have liked it to be. But, in the spirit of the entire argument that I've presented, it's a constrained optimum. I'm not arguing that trial by battle is the first best. It's not. But it is a second best. And it's a second best that looks a whole hell of a lot like our second best. Okay. Please.
I was going to follow up and ask, it seems like there's a positive externality here as well, and that is the public gets to see two champions knock each other. Is that in the paper as well?
It is indeed.
Oh dear.
And it's on a slide just back here, which is what you would expect, right? One of the important predictions of the theory is that if this legal system is actually interested right, and using this thing for efficiency purposes, it should want to do two things. It should want to do one thing in an overarching sense, which is to limit the social cost of this system. Where do the social costs of this system come from? They come primarily from the procedural, what I call the procedural costs, which is the fact that when you put champions in the arena, you've got labor resources that are basically decreasing each other's value. In the limit, you kill the guy. That's no good, right? We actually lose a member of the population. Even when you don't, you bang him up pretty bad. What you want to do then to limit that cost is to be able to have this battle, but to do so in a way that's basically safe. And so what the system did was developed a couple of different rules. In the first place, what it did was that when it ordered champions to pummel one another, it didn't order champions to slay one another, which is what, for those of you who have heard of trial by battle before, what normally comes to mind. Swords weren't used. Instead, we wore protective gear, we wore armor, and we hit each other with short clubs called quarterstaffs. They were literally quarter-long sticks. We clubbed each other, much less lethal. In fact, historians have been able to find 0 cases of anybody who actually ever died in one of these processes, which indicates that it was quite safe. Not that people didn't get hurt, of course. That was one rule that we observe. There's another rule that we observe that suggests that the legal system was interested in minimizing the social cost, this procedural cost of maimed and murdered champions. And that was that what it wanted to do was to ensure that people didn't get killed by giving them an out if they were about to get their skull crushed in. The champion has you in the corner. You're about to have your head bashed in, your brains to become soup. What the legal system does is it has what's called a Craven rule. If when you're lying there you shout out Craven, it's kind of like uncle, and the battle stops. It's a forfeit rule, basically. And it's a forfeit rule that preserves the outcome of the battle, but does so without the costly side effect of turning the guy's brain into soup. Related to your question, what's the other way that we can limit the social cost of this system? The procedural rules that we have, the rules that limit the procedural costs can only do so much. People are still going to get harmed somewhat in this process. But we can minimize that cost by translating what remains into social benefit. And the way we translate it into social benefit is by making this a spectator sport. And that's exactly what the medieval system did. It was a very, very efficient system. Very good in some sense. They erected elaborate stands that created this arena. You didn't have to pay. By the way, why wouldn't they want you to pay? Any guesses? Because it would reintroduce that rent-seeking cost that I talked about before, right? So you don't want proceeds to go in. Very, very clever system. Nobody pays, but you get to watch. And people, by all accounts, at least at the larger ones in the later years, these things were very, very well attended. Very well attended. Thousands of people could attend them. Now, incidentally, this explains why, as I say here, remember before I said, why do we use an auction? Because of transaction costs. Why do we use a legal auction? Because regular auctions are more costly. Why do we use a violent legal auction? Because of this. That explains, in my mind, each of the peculiarities that need to be explained about why a rational system would ever want to adopt this. Please.
I wonder about the entertainment as social benefit from the live performance, because during this period, and really until the 19th century, the idea of society getting benefit or social utility or whatever from entertainment goods like that was very limited. Most glowing evidence is Smith, right? With productive versus unproductive labor. But I think there's another explanation. It goes to what you said earlier about the jury, and that is that you've got public verification. That if you've got an entire, if the whole town witnesses this, then there's no question as to whose combatant actually won, and thus who gets the property, and so you get that social validation benefit.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the latter, and to support that, I disagree, I think, with the idea that entertainment wasn't important. There's plenty of examples of medieval entertainment. I mean, the Normans were the ones who brought this over, right?
No,
certainly were no strangers.
Whether entertainment sort of enters into the social welfare function back in that period.
I see.
Not whether it existed, but whether it was considered a productive social activity in the social benefit cost calculus.
Okay. Well, I guess independent of whether or not judges think about it as entering into it, it's quite clear that people voluntarily show up to this thing and come long distances to do so. No one's compelling them to do so, which suggests that they get some value out of it. So it is helping to reduce the cost in that way. Backing up the second point that you made, which I think is absolutely right, public verification. What happened at the end of one of these things was that the judge publicly pronounced, so-and-so is now the proper holder of parcel X, and then they would name the boundaries of it. And another important thing happened at this point, which was that, at least later in the system, they wrote that puppy down. So they were creating a centralized deed register through the legal process. That was the second way in which it provided validation. By the way, I'm spooked by the quietness of the room. I hope that doesn't mean you're terribly bored. Please.
I'm going to save it till the end.
Oh, I've never gotten more than 2 minutes into a presentation, so I'm.
It's kind of along the, I mean, it's a good place to ask the question.
Sure.
Why you've been talking, and trying to figure out why they would do it. I mean, with what you're talking about for a current system, money's involved, it goes to the public coffers, it goes to the court, whatever that makes sense. You know, there's a reason for it. Why would the legal system, I mean, where's the incentive for the legal system to put these battle?
To put the what? I'm sorry.
The legal system back in the day when trial by battle was common, what economic incentive does the courts have to do it that way? Where are they getting their cut? Basically, why not some other more profitable?
That's a very good question. So, and I don't mean to do harm to it. If my reinterpretation is not correct, stop me. But one way that I would think about putting that is, especially since I'm a public choice type person, why doesn't this assume a benevolent judges? Why is it that justices should care basically about promoting efficient allocations of resources? Is that a fair way to rephrase it, or is that not what you mean?
No, I must not be saying it right. I understand that with what you're presenting as a solution, trial by auction today, money's involved, right?
Yeah.
It goes, like you said, it would go to the court of justice, which I would assume means it would go to some kind of public coffer, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's tax dollars, say. Besides getting to watch a couple guys beat the hell out of each other,
Okay.
where's the incentive for the court back then to do that, as opposed to say, well, why don't we auction it off like you're talking about today, and then I get, as the judge, I say, yeah, we're going to do an auction, and I get to keep the money.
Right.
Why would I say, instead of that as a judge, why would I say, yeah, these two guys are going to beat the crap out of each other, instead of I could benefit?
Okay, right. So I think yes. So I think that the answer to that question is that what you need is a judge to be concerned about social efficiency. If the judge is concerned about efficiency, he doesn't want the proceeds to accrue to the judicial system. Because when proceeds accrue to the judicial system, you get higher rent-seeking costs. Those are the two things I was talking about before, right? So, but you can take your question and pose it back to me, which is what I was trying to go to a moment ago, which is one step earlier, which is, why would judges care about doing that? In other words, isn't this a benevolent despot, a kind of central planner model? And I think that the answer to that is, if that question makes sense, my add-on question, is no. And the reason that it's no is that, say what you will about the feudal system, and I said some nasty things about it a moment ago, but for all of its problems, one thing it didn't lack was property rights in a sense. Everything was privatized, right? Fiefdoms, you could have a benefice, you could have a property right in administering laws in a particular area. A private individual could have that. One of the features of those different owners, some cases that owner is the state, it's the king. In other cases, it's private individuals. But their incentive is to basically minimize disputes in their territories and to maximize the allocation of disputed property rights. Why? Because their revenue comes directly from the proceeds of the earth. If we assign tenancy A into shoddy farmer B's hands when it should have gone into high-quality farmer A's hands, that's less revenue for me. The judge is not that owner, typically. Depends on, in some cases he could be. In a manorial court, he could be the owner, incidentally. The owner of the manor could act as the judge. Ordinarily, that's not going to be the case. But that gives the owner the incentive to basically appoint judges who will act in accordance with his will. Now, there's lots of agency problems here. In other words, it's difficult for the owner to effectively monitor the judges, but he's able to do a decent job of it anyway. We don't see any cases that I'm aware of that in which the judge basically is saying, let me auction this off in the traditional fashion. Doesn't mean it never happened, but I haven't seen anything like that. But I think that's where the incentive to do so comes from.
Thank you.
Sure.
Peter, another piece of this is that the judges are members of the landed class, which is, in some respects at least, they were maybe a little different than in the modern, Lord Judge age. They have an incentive to have an efficient system. I mean, the incentives are perfectly aligned in the absence of an independent judiciary, and here you don't have an independent judiciary.
Yeah. Yeah, when they are the
Trial
owners.
by ballot is efficient. It's in the landed class interest to have that trial by ballot system.
Absolutely. Yep. Okay, where's my little clicker? There's just one other thing I wanted to say, which is this. Consistent with the idea that, I should have started off maybe my talk in a kind of different way. I'll try and say something about it quickly now to make this make a little bit more sense. Historians who have talked about trial by battle, in fact, non-historians who are familiar with trial by battle and talk about it, their typical explanation is to say that, oh, this is just backward. This is just our medieval ancestors doing their crazy stuff again. They were primitive and barbaric. They were irrational. For an economist, that's no good, right? I hate to hear that, and I don't believe that it's ever true. These people were just as smart as us. They were just as rational as us. They just faced a different context. If we faced the same constraints, we would do the exact same thing that they did. That's what economics tells us, and that's the position that I'm taking. The reason that I wanted to say that was that one thing that I think tends to undermine the irrationality hypothesis, if we wanted to take that seriously in the way that some historians have put it forward, is that what you find in this system is exactly the same kind of outcomes that you find, again, in our rational, enlightened system. Most of these cases of trial by battle, just like most legal cases today, were settled. They didn't actually make it to the clubbing people over the head stage. Usually they were settled very shortly after the writ of right was initiated, after battle had been wagered. Sometimes they were settled right before the champions were to walk into the arena, club in hand. In still other times, though fewer of them, the settlement actually happened mid-fight. There was always an incentive to settle as long as the winner of this contest wasn't certain. Think about it. You're disputant A, you've got champion A in the arena. I'm disputant B, I've got champion B in the arena. We're sitting in the stands watching this. All of a sudden, your champion has my guy in a corner. It's clear he's about to get his head bashed in. I expect my champion to shout Craven at any moment. What's my incentive to do? Turn to you and to settle for any price less than what I'm about to lose on the contested property. And that's exactly what happened. Most of those cases of settlement, again, happened before we made it to that point, but in the few where bargaining costs basically precluded that possibility, you get efficient bargains happening in the midst of the battle. There is some, which is remarkable, that were, in my mind anyway, if you work with medieval history, there are some data actually here for what they're worth. We have about 600 cases. Now, sadly, these cases come from a little bit after the period that I focus on. But those 600 cases are still telling. Battle was only wagered in, these are land disputes, I should have clarified, primarily land disputes, I should have clarified that. Battle was only wagered in 38% of them. And it only actually is carried out in 20%. So 80% of the time, you have settlement without ever making it to the arena. Those 20% made it to the arena, but they don't include the cases in which you had settlement mid-battle, which would reduce the number of battles carried to their conclusion still further yet. These numbers are not so radically far off from settlement rates today. Settlement rates today are a bit higher. It depends on the particular type of case you're looking at, but they're not totally far off. Okay, where's my, please?
Is there a separate payment to the champion if it actually went into a fight as opposed to just getting him there?
Yeah, it depended on the contract, but oftentimes yes. So in the paper, I briefly quote some passages from contracts with these guys. In some of the contracts, at least, and I don't want to make a sweeping statement here because I simply can't, but some of the evidence suggests that the champion gets a certain amount if he makes it to the arena, And once he's in the arena, he can get a certain amount for hitting the guy at least once, kind of a thing. And the reason that you might expect some of these kinds of contracts is that you might imagine that there's a possibility of champions colluding. And so you want to incentivize them to basically break the collusion. I think that's part of the reason why we observe that. But so yes, in some...
chance of settling, too, ahead of time. I mean, there's no point in committing to pay somebody to actually fight.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Expect the settling to happen.
Absolutely. Unless, there is still a reason. What you want to do is to, even if you expect that you're never going to go to battle, you want to hire a big gun lawyer because it basically causes your adversary to wet his pants and it allows you to get a better settlement price. So
Still,
you
can
can...
make the lawyer expert if they actually go
Yeah,
to that.
yeah, exactly.
How do you reconcile the stuff you were saying at the beginning about the Naples building Kosian deposit transaction cost, we'll call it Kosian market anyway.
Yeah.
In these situations with the settlement? Is it because the threat points have perhaps changed here, that you've seen, oh, he hired a really big dude, so I'm going to settle? Or, I mean, why would the market work a priori, but it will work in this particular case?
That's,
We get to this level.
I think it's a great question. What I consider this whole legal system as is backdoor Kosianism, right?
So this is where you finally got the property rights, basically where the negotiation can take place?
Exactly.
Backdoor rights, basically.
Exactly. I mean, we have, transaction costs are high in the land market, but they're not high in every market. In fact, one of the things I point to in the paper is that they were clearly extremely low in the market for champions. And the reason that we know that is that we see champions, even the same strong guy, moving with fluidity between you and I. If we were bidding on the guy, okay, I'm working for you, now I'm working for him, there seemed to be no problem there at all. So it's the transaction costs in land that are high. It doesn't seem to affect other markets. And that makes sense because feudalism is about lord-tenant property relationships. That's what it was about. So when feudalism begins to decline, because those consent requirements start to decline, that's when, incidentally, right around this period in which the Council of Windsor makes its decision, back to your question from before, that's when a land market begins to develop. Please.
So you say that it's not common to hold champions on retainer, but
Yeah.
My understanding of the feudal system is that if I own a whole bunch of land and you're my fief on that land, I can use you as I can make you fight for me.
No. Well, that is a common view, but it is not quite right in the sense that feudal contract, the contract, that's the best way to think about it. The contract, the homage contract between a lord and his tenant, homage and fealty were kind of the reciprocal obligations that were made, were kind of hammered out ahead of time. There were expectations. It wasn't like, I'm your slave, you can make me do anything you want, which would be consistent with the idea that the lord could simply force him to do it, right? So there's no reason that the lord can compel the tenant to do anything apart from what the tenant has agreed to do. These really are contractual relationships. That's the best way to think about it. These people entered into these things voluntarily. It doesn't seem to have satisfied you. Tell me more.
I mean, but didn't the king usually call on his lord and say, I expect you to bring 1,000 men to war?
Yeah, the king is a special lord. The king is a special lord because he is the only lord in the system who is nobody's tenant, right? So yes, technically in the feudal ladder, there's two exceptional people, at least in principle. There's, everybody, remember I said before, is a lord and tenant of somebody, except for the king, who is a tenant of nobody, and the lowliest tenant in the system, who is the tenant of someone, but is not the lord of anybody. At least analytically, that's what we have. So that gives the king can say anything he wants, but incidentally, even the king's official, his de facto control over the barons, if you want to think about them that way. They were called tenants in chief. They held the big tracts. Those guys they still weren't in a completely servile relationship with respect to the king. I mean, think about the Middle Ages and all of the conflict that we have, the attempts at trying to hammer out power-sharing agreements between the king and the nobles, precisely because the nobles posed a credible threat. Right? These guys had power. In some cases, especially in France notoriously, right, the nobles wielded more power than the king, which is part of the argument that's been provided for why civil law emerges there, in contrast to the English case.
So if you bring a suit against me,
Mm-hmm.
you still hire my fief to be your champion?
if I bring a suit against you, can I hire your tenant?
Right.
Yes. Yes.
So were there restrictions at all on the champions?
You have the paper open, so you know the answer. Well, you're toward the end. Yes, there were some restrictions. There were quasi-restrictions. One of which is more puzzling, I think, than the other. The first restriction was that in the very early part of the early period of the system, officially the demandant's witness had to be his champion. And importantly, he also was supposed to be, the whole reason, this is another reason why I think people realized it was a sham. Did William of Copeland really observe the fact that my ancestors and his ancestors and all of that baloney that I was telling to the court? Of course not. I just went and bought, everybody saw me go and buy William Copeland like 5 minutes ago. And so the interesting feature of that restriction is that it had absolutely zero teeth. There are no cases in which a court basically finds against someone or says you got to start the process over. There are no cases in which that happens because of a tenant objecting to the fact that the witness is not in fact the champion, even though it happens routinely. So, but the peculiar thing to me, and this is actually the strongest puzzle to me in this whole thing at this point, I feel like there are pretty good answers to many other aspects of the puzzle, and I don't feel like this is that big of a puzzle, but it's something. Why did the system ever have that rule? My best guess at why it had that rule, given that it routinely ignored it, it never seems to have enforced it, even one time, according to the historical evidence. I think the reason it did that is similar to the reason why it pretended that God was determining the outcome of these things. I think it's a very similar phenomenon. Again, that's pure speculation on my part, but you don't want to admit, and in fact, it's 200 plus years after, once we've gotten into the trial by jury period and really trial by battle is basically dead, the court does away with the charade and goes, forget it, just hire whoever the hell you want. That's actually, so they changed the rule. But initially you see this attempt to have a rule, even though it's not enforced, which is consistent with the idea that I want to put on a veneer of legitimacy, but never enforce it because that would actually hamper the efficiency of the system. There's a second rule, which I'm only going to partly remember or possibly get wrong right now, so don't hold me to it. The tenant, the defendant, right, the tenant was initially never allowed to act as his own champion, I believe. And then I believe he was allowed to later on. Or I may have that in reverse. But I don't remember that exact detail, but that was another rule. Again, had zero teeth in the system as far as I can tell. Those are the only restrictions that I'm aware of. Yes?
Are you doing us a disservice by making us question the veneer of legitimacy of our system by comparing it to this one?
I hope not. I hope I'm enlightening you. What I want to do is I am doing you a disservice in the sense that what I said was the functionality of the system depends on whether or not you believe in it. Having said that, let me let you in on a related secret. So this will bring the institutional placebo effect idea to the fore. And then you can tell me if I'm doing you a disservice or not. Maybe I am. Lie detector tests, which our criminal system uses in various ways, it depends on the particular jurisdiction, but are routinely used, for example, in law enforcement, even when they aren't permissible in court. In some places, by the way, they are permissible. By all scientific accounts, lie detector tests are completely and utterly bogus. You cannot actually physiologically measure whether somebody is lying or telling the truth by strapping them to that funny system with the little squiggly lines. That's a bunch of hocus pocus. And because of that, lie detector tests in our system are commonly derided. Lots of people, scientists, point out that lie detector tests are hocus pocus. And there's this kind of heated debate by some other people who probably also believe in alchemy, who run around and say crazy things about how it can measure your state of mind and so on, which is nonsense. Despite that fact, and despite the fact that we've got important people in the scientific community pointing to the illegitimacy of the lie detector, I still think that the lie detector is a really important part of our system. And the reason that I think it's a really important part of our system is because it facilitates what we might call criminal sorting. Even if the lie detector test can't actually tell if I'm lying or telling the truth, if I believe that it can, and many people do despite the fact that they've been told that it's BS, if I believe the lie detector works, the lie detector can work. expecting to be outed by the polygraph, if I'm a believer, guilty persons are more likely to decline it. Innocent persons, on the other hand, who have nothing to hide, and thus no reason to fear undergoing the polygraph, are more likely to be willing to undergo it. That means, not with certainty, but it is still useful, I can infer something, I can gather some information if I'm the legal system about your guilt or innocence based on your decision to undergo a lie detector test. It's useful because you believe in it. Not totally useful, but it's partly useful. If you reposed zero belief in it, it would totally lose that. So, in the sense that I'm alerting you to the fact that a system is BS and that makes you not believe and you would have committed a crime, I'm doing a disservice. But in the sense that in the case in which that wasn't true, I'm not. I'm hopefully providing more information. And as the reason that I said before, part of the reason I'm not worried about the disservice is that it is out there that lie detector tests are bogus. People know that, and yet many people still believe in them. In the same way that it's out there that astrology is nonsense. Lots of people still believe it. People still check their horoscope. You know, in the same way that lots of people think that government intervention is, no, I shouldn't say that. I went down an old road that I go down all the time. Okay.
Question.
Yes.
You were saying that this created a backdoor Coasianism. Were you implying that there was potentially collusion between the tenant and the demandant in creating the market?
I thought about that too. That's not what I meant, but I have thought about that. And my answer is that I don't know, but I'm skeptical that that was the case. And the reason that I'm skeptical that that was the case is that the feudal web created let's say that two lords basically wanted to, they were going to use this system as a way to exchange property because they couldn't get the consent of other people, right? And so they're like, okay, you pretend to challenge my property, we'll go through this little rigmarole, we'll have the exchange. The reason that it could be happening, but the reason that I don't think it was happening is that there were the people whose consent they had to get, or would have had to get that they're trying to circumvent, have very strong incentives to try and knock that kind of a thing down. That's why I'm skeptical, but I am open to the possibility that that was in fact occurring. So that's my unsatisfactory answer, but I have thought about it. Please.
So I'm still struggling with this fundamental question that if the disputants are able to settle and agree on a price in most of these cases, why you can't just have the version of the world in which the judge assigns one of them the property, and then if the other person is on actually higher value of it, they buy it from them, because it's the same thing as settling, basically. It's exactly the same thing. And so I'm kind of still puzzled by that. And I'm wondering if the reason is that this is happening in a time in which settling disputes by violent conflict is culturally acceptable, right? So if the norm is you settle disputes by violent conflict,
yes,
and so the idea that judges can have the authority to settle a dispute in that way isn't part of the culture. And so the idea is that this legal system is basically closing in, trying to reduce the amount of violent conflict. So it's saying, okay, some disputes will be settled by violent conflict, but first we're going to try to screen off the ones where we can just obviously see that someone's in the wrong. And so we can't get to the battle. Mm-hmm. And then when we get to the battle, we're going to limit it by saying it can only be between two people and you can't have any death, right? So it's, chipping away at just two people that get in an argument, settling it through some sort of large violent interaction, right? Because otherwise, if we just want a probabilistic outcome, they could have hired two racers, or they could have hired two people to throw a stone at others, right? But the idea is that violent conflict is the way you settle disputes, then the idea is at least now we've got it down to having two people in armor with clubs, so it's minimizing the violent dispute as much as possible.
Yeah. So on the first, okay, let me see if I can.
There's two questions.
Yes, there's two questions. So on the first one, the answer is that, and again, their effect is the same, but they're not the same, which is why they're not the same for the file. This is the settlement and the why they don't just trade the land. Remember, this is what I was trying to say before, unsuccessfully, is that what precludes the trade in land is the consent requirement. That's why the transaction costs preclude the transaction through the normal channel, through the market. There is no consent requirement once we're in the settling, there is no consent requirement, right? That's why the possibility emerges that all that's happening here is a backdoor Coasian solution of that variety, right? Transaction costs of trading land are high, not the transaction costs of any bargain whatsoever. Many bargains unrelated to land exist. And clearly, they did not have prohibitively high transaction costs. So I think that's exactly why we can have this kind of settlement. The disputants, once we're sitting next to each other, we've gone through the action of the writ of right? Once we've gone through that process, the legal system says you don't have to get the consent of anybody anymore because now we're in a legal dispute. Before we enter a dispute process, I try and buy it from you in the market. The legal system says, go and get 25 people's agreement. If they sign off, you can buy the property from her. That's the peculiarity, and I think exactly why the legal auction is used. On your second question, I am sympathetic with part of what you're saying, but I find another part of it, I'm skeptical or unwilling to go with another part of it. And another part of it sounds dangerously close to me to what historians say. These were violent people. And so they just did things violently. They were violent people. We are also violent people. They were also violent people in 1179 when they gave up much of the system. They remained violent people for centuries. And yet trial by battle in this case did not last for centuries. They also had many, many other disputes, for example, criminal ones, which were not resolved this way. They didn't involve anybody fighting. They involved other cool things, in my mind, like plunging your arm into boiling water or being dunked into a pool to see if you would sink or not. That's what they did for those cases. So I acknowledge that people were violent, but it either explains too much or doesn't explain enough. And I think it has difficulty in particular explaining the fade out and then ultimate demise of trial by battle. The other thing, yeah, I guess that's what I would say. Now, there is a way in which you can make the people were violent argument that I think is complementary to the transaction cost argument rather than a substitute argument. And that is to go back to what I was saying before, and I think what you were saying about what people view as a legitimate way of resolving something. I think the legitimacy of this system, at least the way they explicitly attempted to legitimate it, was not, we believe that fighting resolves conflicts. In fact, it was quite the opposite of that, right? It was, we believe that God favors the righteous. And he also favors him in war, where we have common experience of the war. So he'll favor him in this case too. So in that sense, I think it's connected, but I don't think it substitutes for the transaction costs argument. You don't look persuaded, but...
She also kind of mentioned, like, throw a rock or have a race or something, but then there's way more incentive for the people, the champions, to be bought. I mean, if you're in a fight, you could be bought, but you don't want to get hit with a stick. Like, you're going to try and defend yourself and things, but that's... If you're going to do some sort of non-legal, then I guess fighting is real.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And I also want to add one other thing, which is that if we're at the point in the story where what we're asking is, okay, we see why it was sensible to have a legal auction, but why this particular kind of legal auction rather than another, then I'm quite happy. Because what that means is that we've bought most of the story about what I'm trying to present against the Dark Age ignorance perspective. I'm willing to be flexible on the particular system, although I'm sympathetic with the comment that was made a moment ago. Please.
During those backdoor settlements, where you get board step in and provide money for
Yeah.
demand and what you prefer or for?
Yes. In fact, that's a very good question, and I think it's connected to another question which I wanted to raise, which is that, auctions work well when people have similar endowments. When people have radically different endowments, right, those auctions may not, in fact, reveal the higher valuing user. I happen to strongly dislike that kind of an argument, but it is true. The reason that I don't like it, and I'll tell you why I don't like it, is that it is applied to markets all the time. And I think I think it explains too much. What it says is, but imagine that there's a guy who's really, really poor, and imagine that there are no credit markets. That guy values the donut more, but the rich guy gets to have the donut because he's rich. That's what that argument says. I think there's something to it, but I think it's overused. But in any event, that is related, I think, to the well, I'm going to connect it, hopefully in a way that's sensible, to your question, which is that in this period, right, disputants had different levels of wealth. There's no doubt about that. But the system did two kinds of, I think, pretty cool things to try and make this be more effective, be more likely to reveal the higher valuing user. The first thing that it did was that it tended to limit disputes to people of the same class. Now, the rules about this are kind of vague, but it is quite clear that if you were a very, very lowly tenant, you could not, for example, challenge the king to the Kingdom of England, right? That kind of a dispute would not be allowed. And unfortunately, again, we're working with 11th and 12th century records here. It's hard to say exactly what that means, but it looks like, to me, the legal system is doing something to try and make sure that we're on a more equal footing when we have our auction. More important than that, in my mind, is the fact that in the Middle Ages, there were credit markets. People used them. There's no reason to think that they wouldn't have used them for precisely this purpose. The reason that I thought of this in light of your question is that the primary source, a lot of times I didn't have to go to a formal credit market in order to get access to capital if I was capital constrained. My lord, if he thought I was the higher valuing disputant, remember my lord is a part owner, in fact a more full owner of the property of which I'm a tenant than I am. He has a strong incentive to help me to buy a better champion so that I can defeat the adversary because I'm worth more to him on that piece of land than the adversary is. So that was a long-winded way of saying yes. Okay, what time do we go to, by the way?
5:30?
Okay. I don't mean, please by all means have questions. This is my last formal comment, so here it comes. First, as you've already gotten a sense, I'm sure, I think it is quite silly, to be honest, and to put it strongly, that trial by battle was irrational. I think it's quite clear that it was rational. And I think that Montesquieu, by the way, who I love, Montesquieu called the system barbarous, which is consistent with the primitive people are barbaric argument. But what I want to argue is that the monstrosity of trial by battle is directly proportionate to the monstrosity of allocating resources efficiently. For an economist, at least, that means that trial by battle wasn't monstrous at all. It did exactly what we would like it to do. What trial by battle does is reflects the medieval legal system's attempt to discover a higher valuing user of a contested parcel of property in a context in which that information was especially valuable. The reason that that's important is that when information about who the higher valuing user is especially valuable because transaction costs are high, the system is, quite predictably, willing to go through more, at least superficially, absurd and costly procedures to get access to that information. It just doesn't make sense to have a system like this, which does have costs despite its attempts to minimize those, right? It minimizes them, but it doesn't eliminate them. It's quite silly to have a system like this in our current context. The reason, however, moving down to here, isn't because we're more sophisticated than our medieval predecessors. It just isn't. It's not because we're more rational. It's not because we're better people. It's because we face different relative prices of the same activities than they did. It's economics all the way down. This, by the way, as a side plug, not that I'm sure many of you in this room need a plug for this, is why I love economics. I truly believe that economics explains everything. And I certainly think that it explains trial by battle. The other thing, which I think points to what I hope to pursue, and I hope others will pursue in future research, is the idea that we can use legal arrangements, backdoor Coasianism. We can use legal arrangements to substitute for the traditional Coase theorem, if you'll allow me to be abusive of that term for a moment. To substitute for the Coase theorem, where that theorem's logic breaks down in the face of high transaction costs. And, to me, again, it's a Coasean world. What we see all the time are Coasean solutions to the obstacles that stand in the way of our ability to realize the mutual gains from trade. I think trial by battle is simply a special and kind of violent version of that. Yes?
So I buy the argument that relative prices have changed and we've evolved into a different system where, to some extent, we're still sort of revealing the highest valuing user by their expenditures on legal resources. But then why a jury trial? So as somebody who's got a jury summons sitting on their table, I'm reflecting on the fact that everybody in this system did so voluntarily. They were paid to participate, they chose to do it, except maybe the person dragged into the frivolous lawsuit.
You mean the trial by battle thing?
Yes, and so I'm gonna show up, and there's a social cost, I like to think, of me spending a day there, and is it?
One more administrator out of the office.
And so is that all explained by sort of the legitimacy value that you gain? Or, I mean, I think a judge, I mean, we're in a world with few transaction costs for most of the transactions we're talking about. A judge could weigh the evidence and flip a coin and perhaps do a better job than I. We're gonna have however many people sitting there.
We're a professional jury. And I'm thinking the same thing. And why is that linked to suddenly this market for land that springs up?
Why trial by jury?
Yeah.
Well, let me do the one part and then come to the second part. So I think on the first part, I do think it's legit. You know what I just said about lie detectors a moment ago? I think, don't tell anybody, most people think that trial by jury actually determines the facts of the matter. And because they believe that system works well. If criminals think 12 people in a box are likely to figure me out. Exactly. That's why I think we use it. Now, that begs the question of, well, why is that being introduced here? And I don't have a good answer, but I'm going to make some stuff up. No, I'm not really. I'm going to tell you what I think. What I think is that the reason that at this period in time, why they use trial by battle when they start to phase out, they use trial by jury when they start to phase out trial by battle, is the fact that trial by jury already has legitimacy. And the reason it has legitimacy was, as I mentioned before, in the assizes of Clarendon and the assize of Northampton, some years before, that procedure is introduced as the new criminal procedure when unilateral ordeals, the boiling your arm thing, when that goes away. So I think that explains, so it already has legitimacy, which is why it's adopted here. Now, a rightful, and I'm sure is what you're thinking, a good, reasonable response is, okay, well that just backs it up another level. Why at the end of ordeals did they adopt trial by jury? I can provide further historical stuff that says, well, look, here are some predecessor things. They had a thing called a jury of presentment. That was the predecessor. It was kind of like a grand jury. It wasn't like the petite jury that they used even earlier. And so that explains why ordeals had it. But that just pushes it back a step further. And eventually we come down to, why is anybody at any point in time when they run into a problem, when some system goes away, saying, let's get some neighbors and have them come together and say stuff? And I don't have a really good answer, but I have a speculative one. And that one is that the further back in time you go, probably in some sense, and I don't want to hang too much on this, but in some sense, jury may have worked better. The old school trial by jury was not like the one today where don't read the newspaper, don't talk to your friend, all that stuff. It was the opposite. Go around and inquire with people in the neighborhood. The jurors were actually encouraged by the judge to go and investigate the matter for themselves, to talk with other people, to dig up as much information about the disputants or disputants as possible. In that world where you've got small communities and jurors actively digging, I actually think that system is pretty good at fact-finding, because you can actually dig up dirt on the guy who's being tried, or the absence of dirt. The weird thing is that our current system, by eliminating precisely that part, I think is in large part moved away from the very thing that might make trial by jury actually functional.
I'm just thinking, you've got these two systems. They're competing, right? The trial by jury, trial by battle. And trial by jury becomes a viable option when how do I put this? What would make trial by jury sort of more, why would it outcompete it, trial by battle? Could be something about the quality of lawyers or the variation in the quality of lawyers versus the variation in the quality of champions, or the information that's available to both contestants, both sides. Could there be something about, so you talked about the legitimacy of the champions, and it was just very obvious, hey, you bought a bigger champion, he won. But maybe that's not the case with lawyers, right?
Maybe, but I mean, what do you think? I mean, right, so we're part of our current legal process. I happen to be, this is a touchy subject at the moment, I happen to be being sued by a guy who put up shades in my house not long ago. One of the things that I like to think is that, in addition to the fact that the facts are on my side, that I will buy a better lawyer than he will, and that will allow me to prevail. I think that a lot of people, normally they point to it as a bad thing for our system. You can buy justice. It's like, well, sometimes that's a good thing that you can buy justice. That's my answer. But the point is that the fact that some people think that you can buy justice means that there might be something to this issue of the higher quality lawyer being better. Now, one way you could test it, and I'm sure somebody has done it, is to look at, in fact, as I mentioned earlier, the question that I posed, are higher legal expenditures in fact correlated with legal victory? There's a lot of confounding variables, but I bet a scatter plot would be very eye-opening about the basic thrust of that relationship. And I suspect that there's probably a pretty strong relationship, but I could be totally wrong. But my impression is that a lot of people think that there is that auction element, that the better lawyer will win or is more likely to win. But what do you think?
So I think I've got this question better formulated now, or my point better formulated. I think the idea is trial by jury has this veneer of legitimacy, and clearly, you're arguing that it's just a veneer. But certainly when it's new, right, when it first gets introduced, and trial by battle is sort of looking a little jaded, I could see why I would outcompete trial by battle. And the same thing, it's easy to look at the height of your champion, the weight of your champion, the speed of your champion.
Mm-hmm.
But lawyers, especially when the system just gets introduced, it's not clear to me which lawyer is going to win.
You also don't even have lawyers initially in the process. But you're right, absolutely.
And so it's outcompeting trial by battle in the sense of in the legitimacy sense, as opposed to the sense of more efficient allocation.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think that there is a trade-off on the allocation. That's what I want to say, is that you're trading off. You're looking more legitimate, but you're getting more inefficient allocations. But the thing is that it's actually optimal to do that because the transaction costs of trade are low, right? This gets back to what I was, now it doesn't matter. Who cares that we're trading off? We get more legitimacy is efficient in that world, right? The relative price of more legitimacy has fallen precisely because there now is a market for trade such that judges' initial allocation is less important.
And this is just because, well, there's no lawyers.
I mean, once a market in land emerges, now what we want to do is to move towards more legitimacy, even if it means that we're getting less accurate initial assignment.
So this is
That's all that we're saying.
harder to buy a jury than it is to buy a champion.
You mean why is the allocative efficiency lower?
Yeah.
Well, partly because initially there aren't lawyers, but also that is true, that presumptively it's harder to bribe a jury. Yes.
Sorry.
That's all I have.
My